Hello. This week in Britain, a man appeared in court whose name you in America can be forgiven for not having heard of. And if the truth be told, very few Britons have heard of him either. The man in question is Nathan Gill. Gill is a former leader of the Reform Party, the Reform UK party in Wales. Reform UK as a political party can trace its roots back to the United Kingdom Independence Party, Nigel Farage's UKIP, the party that drove the Brexit campaign to leave the European Union. Now, Gill was a member of the European Parliament. In those days, I knew him. I didn't know him particularly well, but I came across him because he was a member of the party I led, a tall man who deliberately used his height, employed long handshakes and affected a smooth manner to convey a false persona of confidence, gravitas and domination, and to conceal a lack of genuine conviction. He was a man I instinctively distrusted and, frankly, disliked. An insincere man who I always suspected would be quite happy to sell his grandmother. A political opportunist rather than a political thinker. A man who repelled me. But there are many such people in the politics of the West. But others thought otherwise. Most UKIP members of the European Parliament crossed to Nigel Farage's Brexit party when it was formed. Gill was one of them. He was then later one of the only survivors of a cull of those MEPs, those members of the European Parliament, who were allowed to follow Farage when the party evolved into Reform UK. He was then appointed as Reform UK's leader in Wales. This week, Nathan Gill was convicted in a court of law, a criminal court. He was convicted of 8 counts of accepting briberies and 2 counts of attempted bribery. But this was no ordinary case of yet another corrupt politician. These charges were all linked to Russian influence operations. Now, bribery in politics is, very sadly, nothing new on either side of the Atlantic, but bribery connected to a hostile foreign state and aimed at shaping the conduct of a man who might one day sit in the governing party is a different matter. And that, America, is why this obscure British legal case matters to you as much as it matters to us on this side of the Atlantic. You see, Gill is not the only example. Across Europe, intelligence services have been warning for some years that Russian money, influence and access operations are penetrating mainstream politics far more deeply than the public realises. Only this week, an investigation by the EU Observer revealed that the Kremlin has quietly cultivated more than 70 European politicians and officials. Not fringe activists, but high-profile political figures through a web of front organisations, cultural associations, illicit funding channels, and personal courtesies and favours dressed up as friendship diplomacy. Now, some of those individuals sit in national parliaments in Europe. Others have shaped European party platforms, foreign policy debates, and even public messaging on Ukraine. And only last month, the British Domestic Security and Counterintelligence Service, MI5, issued a rare public warning to members of the British Parliament and their staff. The warning advised them to watch out for unusual social interactions, unusual contacts through professional networking sites such as LinkedIn, and over-the-top flattery. They were warning of foreign powers manipulating our democratic processes and eroding the foundations of our sovereignty. Doesn't get much more serious than that. The pattern is unmistakable. Carefully targeted outreach, small favours that grow into obligations, and messaging lines which, often unknowingly or unwittingly, track closely with the Kremlin's strategic goals. Now, another United Kingdom Independence Party MEP, member of the European Parliament, a man called Bill Etheridge, accepted an invitation to travel to Yalta in Russian-occupied Crimea in 2018. As party leader, I warned him not to. He did go anyway, and my successor then later expelled him from the party for doing so. Now, these incidents, as you can see, are not isolated. They're part of a pattern. A long-running campaign by Moscow to cultivate, compromise, and simply nudge certain voices in Western political discourse towards a sympathetic position for the Russian cause. Now, Russia does not need to sway millions of people in Europe and North America. It only needs to influence a few who stand close to power or who themselves can be a voice that is then amplified by our media as so-called expert commentary. And sometimes Moscow doesn't even need ideological believers. It only needs people like Nathan Gill, men who lack integrity and can be bought, encouraged, flattered, or steered, or all of the above. These people will sometimes, but not always, be decision makers. They may be found in all levels of politics, academia, or the media, or listened to by such people. Now, Moscow's purpose is through them to shape the narrative and prevailing public and political discourse and perceptions. And one can hardly help but speculate at this time whether that influence is already being felt in the policies of countries like the United States. Because over recent months, a particular narrative has taken hold on both sides of the Atlantic, there in the United States of America, here in the United Kingdom, and to an extent in other European countries. A narrative about Ukraine, a narrative about realistic peace, territorial realities, and historic spheres of influence, and security guarantees for both sides. Now, these are not, I know, phrases invented in Washington or London. They are direct translations of Russian diplomatic vocabulary, identical to language used by the Kremlin for decades. Not everyone repeating them is compromised, of course. Many simply misunderstand what's going on. Others simplistically want an end to a difficult conflict without really understanding that sometimes a bad peace now could lead, as it did after World War I, to a far worse conflict later. Some seize on such lines because they simplify a complex world for these individuals. They make the world a simpler place, more straightforward, perhaps more easy to understand. But the uncomfortable question, America, is this: how many repeat Kremlin lines, unwittingly, because someone like Nathan Gill has encouraged them to think that way, or simply because they've heard influential people like Gill say these things? How far has that influence already travelled in Western debate? Influence operations work like water. They permeate society's political debate and culture like water finds its way through a porous rock. Western political thinking is particularly vulnerable because very few politicians or media personalities actually understand, even if they think they do, strategy. For years, I personally have argued in politics, on television and in writing that far too few Western politicians can distinguish between lists of intentions and actual strategy. A list is not a strategy. A list is not a plan. But political manifestos persistently treat bullet points as plans, and ministers use tactics and call them vision. And when confronted with complex challenges, they respond not with foresight and planning, but with an incoherent set of individual reactions. Now, I've obviously been told, as some of you will think, that I am wrong. But I have seen the consequences of this sort of strategic illiteracy. I saw it in Afghanistan. I saw it in Europe's response to Ukraine in 2014. I saw it in North Africa and across the Balkans, and I've seen it now, or I see it now even, in London and Washington, particularly in Washington. I see it in the way so many false narratives spread without anyone pausing to actually ask who is shaping them and why. Why is it, for example, that we all seem to have accepted, or most people have, at face value, the narrative presented by President Putin when he issued his list of demands in December 2021 before his invasion? That he claimed that NATO had acted provocatively, that Ukraine was killing its own people, although this narrative is demonstrably false. We, and indeed some of our leaders, have perhaps accepted it, simply because it has been persistently repeated by notable academics, commentators, and second-tier politicians, all vulnerable to flattery, all seeking publicity, the publicity that is the lifeblood of their careers, and all sufficiently authoritative to be able to sound and present themselves as credible. Now, many of these are listened to by policy decision makers. That is why the Gill case is so very important. Not because he was a senior national figure, he wasn't, but because he was still representative and represented a value to a hostile state. The usefulness of a compromised individual in the right place is not measured by their fame, it is measured by their proximity to influence. Had Gill not been caught, had he still been the Reform UK's leader in Wales, when, as seems quite possible, Reform UK wins the next general election in the United Kingdom and forms the government here, he would have been in the room when serious decisions were made. He may even have been a government minister. He would certainly have been advising those who were. And that is how influence operations work, quietly, slowly, and softly, precisely when the stakes are at their highest. And the stakes could not be much higher right now. A Moscow-framed peace plan is circulating on both sides of the Atlantic. Voices in Washington and London are echoing it. And the language is unmistakably Russian in origin. There is no denying that. So the question for both of our nations, the United States and Great Britain, is simple. Are we forming our own judgments, or are our judgments being shaped by someone else's narrative through the influence of people like Nathan Gill? Influence operations are insidious. Influence operations are dangerous. Whilst the war in Ukraine is being fought out on the ground and in the air between swarms of drones, that war is also dependent, as Moscow knows very well, on Ukraine's political, economic, diplomatic, and material support from the West. And it is that battle that is being fought out in Washington, London, Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and elsewhere in the West. It is a battle for influence. It is a battle over perceptions, and it's a battle for ideas. And Moscow is playing that battle. The question is, are you in the United States, is your government, is our government actually having its thinking shaped by those in the Kremlin? Good night.
That was Letter to America by Henry Bolton. For further episodes, please follow or subscribe. Thank you.